Someone said, raise your hand if you wanted to look at the webcast while it was going on. Okay, I remember there was one person. I can do that for you right now. Just kidding, I won't do that. Okay. A good start, right? Okay, great. All right, so where was I? Okay, so facebook.com/samlog95. Facebook looks at my URL, right? So I hit /samlog95. Facebook says, okay, like this is a request to my servers. Great. What did Sam want? It looks at the URL and says, okay, samlog95 means that something should happen. Some action should happen. So it says /samlog95 should go to a controller, right? This controller says, okay, I have this request and I know what I want to do, so I'm going to do the thing that I want to do, which is go into my database and grab what I remember about Sam, right? I put in stuff, I told Facebook about myself. When I registered, I wrote, this is my name, this is my phone number, this is my profile picture, right? And at that point in time, Facebook reaches into the model, into its database, and grabs out my information. It gets that information ready, and then it sends it over to the view. And in the view is where I get to see, where I get to see my information. That is one complete request. Okay? So, with this in mind, turn to your neighbor and talk about this question. What file gets touched second when I go to localhost /Pokemon? Talk to your parent. All right, so when you have an answer, hold up your fist like this. So when you have an answer, hold up your fist. If you're not ready, too bad because we're moving on. Hold your fist like this, and when I say on 3, we're gonna hold the number of fingers, okay? So you won't be influenced by other people, okay? Everyone ready? 1, 2, 3. Show me. Okay, most of you guys said 2. 2 is the correct answer. Congratulations. Okay, so applause. So what happened? As I just mentioned before, right? When I go to this URL, first the server needs to say what is the user trying to do when I go to that URL? I need to figure out what code to route, right? So I go into routes.rb and say, okay, /Pokemon matches something inside Pokemon's controller. So I go to Pokemon controller second. Right? So that's the answer to the question. In Pokemon's controller, so /Pokemon, so typically the convention for URLs like this is when you say like /something plural, like Pokemons or users or like posts, that usually means the index action, right? The index action refers to like usually seeing a list of a bunch of stuff. So in this case, a list of Pokemon, right? So the Pokemon's controller says, okay, like for this URL, this is what I want to show the user. I want to show all the Pokemon. So I reach into my models file, I grab all the Pokemon. I get it ready for the view by storing it in an instance variable, right? So @Pokemon equals Pokemon.all. Once that is ready, then it renders index.html.brb and we're good to go. All right, cool. So I have another question for you guys. So think to yourself, I'll give you guys 2 minutes to think on your own. So think quietly. How do I query for all the Pokemon that are above level 30? for 30 more seconds. All right. And when you think you have an answer, hold out your fist again. All right. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Show me. Talk to your partner. All right. Yes. So when you have an answer, hold out your fist, but not keep talking. No rush, no rush. But just when you're ready, show me. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's go through the answers. I saw a pretty even split between 1 and 2. Okay, so number 4 is kind of the odd one out, and you can kind of tell that when there is one that's the odd one out, it's probably not the right answer. So, at Pokemon level 30. So first of all, at Pokemon is not the Pokemon model class. It's an instance of the model. And therefore, it contains information about one Pokemon, but not other Pokemon. So it doesn't even make sense to call that level. And plus, that level is probably not even a method on Pokemon. Okay. So number 3, Pokemon the Fa15. What does that do? Why didn't you guys put it? What do you think? What's your name? Myra. What did you think, Myra?
It would find Pokemon with the ID 30.
Exactly. So .find means find me the Pokemon with this ID. All right, cool. And so I kind of asked you guys a little tricky question because 1 and 2 look pretty similar. But the difference between 1 and 2 is that basically Rails doesn't know to interpret 2. So if I wrote Pokemon.where level colon and I wrote just 30, the string, it would be okay. But as it is, it doesn't know how to parse the fact that I want to get the levels that are greater than 30. So actually, number 1 is the way you would create Pokemon that are greater than level 30. You guys look kind of frustrated. Yes.
So if for like number 2, if it just said level colon 30, would that mean just the Pokemon level 30 or all Pokemon?
Yeah, so the question was, if I did the second one level colon 30, would that find, like, what would I get, basically? And the answer is you would get all the Pokemon that have level 30 in the database. That's right. So, you guys are going to hate me for this, but I have one more question. Frustration is good. When you make mistakes, that's when you learn. That's when you actually. There's a study that shows that when you get something wrong in a class, that's actually when you form neurons, but not when you get things right. So struggle. What is this question? Think to yourself for 2 minutes. Think to yourself. All right. When you have an answer, show me your fist. Me too. All right, so show me a number. 1, 2, 3. All right, talk to your neighbor. All right, and when you're ready, show me a fist. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. Man, you guys all put 4. You guys are cop-outs. But just kidding, that's the right answer. So, okay, so let's go through the choices. Okay, so let's start with 1. Pokemon.find user.find2. Okay, so what will user.find2 get me? It will get me the user with ID 2, right? But when I take that and put it into Pokemon.find, find does not know what to do with my user, right? Because find takes in what? Find takes in IDs in the database, right? So it wouldn't know what to do, it would give me an error. In fact, the error that it would give me is unable to find Pokemon with ID some user, right? Because it looks for the ID of the thing you passed in. Okay, cool. So number 2, Pokemon.where ID 2. So this will not give us what we want because our Pokemon, well, we don't even have a Pokemon with ID 2, and it definitely does not belong to Sam. Okay, so number 3, Pokemon.where user.name is Sam. So this is actually a syntax error right here, user.name, because so what happens when I say something colon something else is I make a dictionary, like a Python dictionary. Okay, in Ruby we call it a hash, but it's essentially the same thing. So I say make a hash with user.name is a key and Sam. But the thing about hashes is that the key cannot be a computed value when you just declare it like this. So if I wrote name colon Sam, that would be syntactically valid. But user.name Sam is not syntactically valid. Not only that, it wouldn't be correct because, well, it's impossible. The question is impossible. Why is it impossible? What about this question is impossible? What do you think? What's your name? Give you an answer. So she's, sorry, tell me your name again. Linda. Linda says the 2 tables are completely unrelated to each other. And that's right. Right? You look at this table of Pokemon, and you say, okay, I think Pokemon belong to user, but how do I know? How do I know which user Charmander belongs to? From my database, I have no darn clue. It could belong to any one of these guys. Users don't know which Pokemon belongs to whom either. There's no way to get the information that I want out of my database, right? So what do we need? So this is just a problem, right? So what we need a new column. So if we started with this, we need some way for Pokemon to know who I belong to. So if I Charmander, I want to know that I belong to Sam, or Bulbasaur wants to know that he belongs to Mark, right? So we need a new column. We need a column called user ID, right? So we call this, in database language, we call this a foreign key. But essentially, you can think of it like this. Before I get to know who I belong to, so I need some way to keep track of that information. So now with this column, if I want to know who Bulbasaur belongs to, I can say, oh, I look at who I belong to because I have a reference to a user, and I can say I belong to user ID 2, which is Mark. And if I'm Charmander, I can say I belong to a user with ID 1, that's Sam. And so the key idea here is model associations. We touched on this briefly last week, but we want to go more in depth this week because not only is it a concept you'll see all the time, but you also need it for your projects. So we didn't want you guys to just like drown. All right. So one model can belong to another, and one model can have many of another model. Pokemon can belong to a user, right? And users can have many Pokemon. That's a key idea. So what we do in Rails is we add these two lines. Okay. So in the Pokemon.rb file under class Pokemon, I say belongs to user. And in the user file, I say has many Pokemon. But the key idea here, okay, so what happens when I add those two lines is that Rails does some magic, basically. But it's not really magic because it's just code. And what it does is it's code that creates methods, all right? So when I say a user has many Pokemon, what I'm saying is I am defining these methods on user models. So after I write that line in the user.rb file, I can say @user. If I have a user stored in @user, I can say user.pokemons. And what Rails does is it goes back to our table. So when I ask Rails for this, Rails will say, okay, great, go back to the table. There you go. All right, so it goes back to here and says, okay, if I'm Sam wants his Pokemon. What do? I look in this table and I say, okay, well, the Pokemon with user ID 1 belong to Sam. I will grab those and return it back. Okay, so that's what happens. Now, to be very clear, that's what the has many line does. The has many line does not create the relationship for you completely, right? The has many just defines the methods that will work if your database is structured correctly. All right. Now the belongs to does the reverse. Okay, so the has many in users defines the methods on user objects. The belongs to, so you always see them together, but to be very clear, this is what each of them do. The belongs to method creates methods on Pokemon. All right, so it makes sense to ask a Pokemon for its user. So I can go to the Pokemon and say Pokemon.user. And again, back to that table that we saw earlier. It'll go look at the Pokemon, look for its user ID, and then grab the user with that user ID. Okay? So it pretty much does this. It pretty much does the hard work of making the database queries for us, and we just have to worry about getting the code and the concepts correct. Now, there's a lot more methods that belongs to and has many as. I only talked about 2, all right? And that's what the docs are for. So the docs here, you can also Google this. If you Google Ruby on Rails associations, you can hit this link. This is really small, but what this says is has many as all of these methods. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to see here, but it says .collection of destroy, .clear, .size. Okay, so what this allows us to do is to say like user.pokemons, because collection is our collection is the collection of Pokemons that belong to me. I can ask it for how many there are. I can ask it whether I have any Pokemon or not. And I can do all this because has many belong to give me that functionality. You define these methods for us. Okay. So these 3 methods are probably the most common ones that you'll see. So what this is saying is @user.pokemon just grabs me the Pokemons that belongs to me. Pokemons.build. It initializes a new Pokemon without saving it to the database with the user ID like set correctly. Okay, so let me be clear. Okay, so if I create a new Pokemon, right, I get to fill in all the fields, right? And the question is, well, depending on what I set the user ID to, that is who the Pokemon belongs to. Right? So when I say I want to create a Pokemon that belongs to Mark, I have to say I want to create a Pokemon with some attributes, but the user ID must be 2 if I want it to belong to Mark. Okay? And so that's what @user.pokemons.build does for us. And you can ask, well, what's the point if we can already set attributes on our own, right? I can just do like Pokemon.new and then Pokemon.userid equals 2, right? And the truth is that those two things are equivalent. Those two things are exactly the same. Setting the user ID is the same as creating it through the Rails nifty methods. But just this way is a little bit more succinct. So you'll see this more often. User.Pokemon.size, it just asks for how many Pokemon a user has. So how many Pokemon match user ID do I have? Right? So I've got one more question. Which of these lines error? Think about it for 2 minutes. All right, and when you have an answer, show me this. All right, well, you're going to have to give me an answer. So take a guess if you don't know. 1, 2, 3. All right, talk to your neighbor. All right. You give an answer, show me your fist. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. Very nice job. You guys are all correct. All of the lines error. Why? Why? Someone tell me why. So you say, sorry, what's your name? Trishal.
I have the whole security itself. It's very good method.
So Trishal says the methods are undefined.
Yeah, I'm not sure it belongs to, but defines it writes the code for you that sort of defines these sort of functions. But methods are actually where we call them Rails. But my guess is that just by writing belongs to maybe you're on getting all the methods that you do that.
Okay, so he doubts belongs to and has been. He doubts the Rails code. All right, any other? What do you think, Helen?
If it's for the tables right there, so the tables will have the column users.
Good answer. What did I forget? I forgot the user ID column, right? So I can write has many and belongs to, and Rails will actually define the methods for us. It actually defines the methods for us. I write how the name belongs to, but if the database does not have the column, how will it know what to do? It doesn't know how to do anything. Yeah, question?
You go back one second.
Yeah.
So for like you see that as a column for user ID, is there a name convention? Like it needs to be like users, the inner table name, _ ID?
Great question. What's your name?
Russell.
Russell. So Russell asked, is there a convention for what the column name has to be? And the answer is yes, there is. So I only talked about like having a user _ ID column before. And the reason for that is because Rails infers that column will exist when I say it belongs to a user. When I say Pokemon belongs to a user, Rails says, oh, you probably will name the column user ID. And so by default, it'll guess that there's a column called user ID and look for it. When it doesn't find that column, right? So these methods are all defined. These methods are all defined because a row belongs to and has many. But when Rails sees that there's no user ID column, it errors. That's what it is. You'll get a database error because you'll say column, something does not exist. All right, and the question is, well, is there a convention? The convention is the _ID, the part before that _ID is usually the name of the model that you're referencing. And then the question is, well, can it be different? And the answer is yes, if you pass in some more options into has many. Specifically, if you say, or belongs to. So specifically, if you say belongs to user, and then I forget the exact argument, but if you say belongs to user, and then like the column name is like foo ID, then it'll look for the foo ID column. You can override its defaults, but by default, that's the name that it is. Great question. Any other questions? Yes. What's your name? Kanad. Yeah.
So if you create a new user ID column, but you don't actually fill it out with a bunch of IDs, so you leave some Pokemon without users too. Does it just not recognize those users? Like Pokemon user, that is error out.
Great question. So the question was, what happens if I have a user ID column, but I don't fill in like every single row inside of that column? What happens? And the answer is, well, from the user's point of view, nothing bad happens, right? From the user's point of view, when I ask Sam for his Pokemon, I just look for a user ID with 1. I don't really care about anything that's not 1. From the Pokemon's point of view, it doesn't. So that kind of represents conceptually a Pokemon that has no trainer, a Pokemon in the wild, so to speak, right? So that probably sounds familiar to you guys if you guys are working on the project, right? So the Pokemon, if the user ID column is nil or null in SQL, then what happens when you ask for Pokemon.user is that it returns nil. So it doesn't error. It doesn't error because it finds the column, and it's possible that a Pokemon does not belong to a user yet. It'll just be nil. Great question. Yeah.
So in the users table, we get to define a similar sort of column for the Pokemon, because you said that the Pokemon is going to define how to be users, so it might be the other way around as well.
So the question was, do I have to define a Pokemon's ID column on the users, right? That's your question. Yeah. And the answer is not quite. The answer is not quite. Why not? Why is it? So my answer to that is that it's unnecessary to define a Pokemon's ID column for users. And then my question is, why is it unnecessary?
I mean, it's not necessary. I mean, it would be slower because like you have to go through the whole Pokemon's table, right, to be able to find the bigger user identifier before.
That's right. That's good insight. So he said it'll be slower. So it's not you don't necessarily need to keep track of like in the user's table point of view, like which Pokemon the user has. But it'll be slow because you have to look through all the Pokemon every time you need to ask the user for his Pokemon. And the answer is yes. It's a great insight. You actually do have to look through all the Pokemon. There is a way to make it faster. In fact, there's a way to make it run in almost constant time, and we'll see that in today's lab. All right. So back to what I forgot. I forgot the user's ID column. All right. So how do I make a user's ID column? So if I have this table, what do I have to do? What do I have to do in order to create this user's ID column to appear? What are the steps?
Make a migration.
Say that again?
Make a migration.
Make a migration, exactly, right? When we need to make a change to the structure of our database, when we need to make a change to the structure of our database schema, we make a migration. And I am about to do a live demo, but before that, Howard would like to come up and make some announcements.
All right, just really quickly, how many of you guys actually got the email from Piazza last night and read it? Okay, it's a good amount of use, but this is just to reiterate. So basically, there's part of the project that wasn't working. It was when after you kind of like fix the first problem, you'll get like this SCSS error. And the problem was that in our gem file where we like define our dependencies and whatnot, we didn't specify a version number, and that version number got updated between the last time we released the project and this time. So the new version doesn't work. And the way to fix it is either you specify the old version number, which is listed on the Piazza page, or the GitHub is already updated, so you can either pull from that. And because like we didn't fix this problem until like a week later, you got a week extension on your project. So yeah. Oh yeah, and one more thing. If homework 3 is graded, if you think there's a problem with your grade, like you believe you did the homework and you got like a 0, for example, you might have messed up the link or something. But if you believe there's any problem, just email us. And I think that's it.
All right. Now, if I can finagle this thing back onto my shirt. Can you guys hear me? All right. All righty. So let's get started. I'm going to toss this over here. Okay, and my terminal is over here, but I want you to be over here. All right, so I have here a mostly new Rails repo. I want to run Rails server and show you what it looks like. All right. I have a pending migration error. What does this mean I have to do? Migrate. Okay, so pretty simple. Let me make that bigger. All right, so Rails, oops, migrate. There we go. All right, so I had some migrations because I had set up a couple of models before. Specifically, get this wire out of my face. Specifically, I have a Pokemon model and a user model. And this is what my schema looks like. Is that visible to you guys in the back? All right, let me make it bigger. All right, how about now? Better? Want it bigger? All right, cool. So I have a Pokemon's table and a users table. This is basically what we're talking about for the entirety of lecture. So hopefully it shouldn't be anything too new. And what I will want to do is seed my database. So how do I seed my database? I heard it, rakedb seed, right? So seeding a database, just to go over really quickly. So in my seeds.rb file, I have told Rails how I want my, so when I first created this app, I created some models, and then I had no models in my database to begin with, right? I had no Pokemon, I had no users. And so one easy way to create them, which is called seeding your database with like some some beginning data, is to go into seeds.rb and create the models that I want to just start off with. So the way I do that is I run rakedb. And when I do that, hopefully nothing appears because that means that everything works correctly. And when I do that, I can go into my browser and refresh. And there are my Pokemon. And here are my users. Okay, so That's that. Any questions about that first part, that setup part? All right. So now what I want to do, so my goal for today is so Pokemon and users are separate entities from each other. And what I want to do today is I want Pokemon to belong to a user, and I want that to be shown on my web app. All right. So starting from the models I have now, what's the first step I have to do? We just went over this. What is the first thing I have to do? What was that?
Are the models already there, or?
The models are already here. So the models are here, and the models have these attributes.
You guys look belong to the thing, right? As many belong to. I'll probably add a column to user.
Right. I have to add the user ID. Right. That's the first step. If I add has many belongs to, let's see what happens. Although I've already kind of given away the answer before. But when I say user has many Pokemons, I can go into my Rails. So first of all, if I go to users, nothing errors out. Nothing bad happens yet. Why not? You think it hasn't been migrated? Okay, any other thoughts? I added has many to, I said a user has many Pokemons. I did not say a Pokemon belongs to a user. I did not add a column to my Pokemon's table, but I'm not getting an error. What happened? What do you think? Exactly. So the answer was, I never use anything that involves a user related to Pokemon, right? In this view, all I did was say, show me the users and the attributes. And I didn't even ask the users like what Pokemon belong, like whose Pokemon you had. So I can show you where the error would occur. The error would occur if I go into Rails console and I take a look at my users, and if I get the first user whose name is Ash, and I ask him for his Pokemons. And here, as I mentioned before, I get a database exception. What does my exception say? It says no such column, Pokemons.userid, right? I'm missing my column. This is the error that I expect to happen. Any questions about this? All right, so let's do it. Migration is Rails G migration, and I want to call it add user ID to Pokemon. Now, one thing to clarify about migrations is that I can name them whatever I want. But the naming, Rails doesn't really care about the name of the migration, but it's helpful for me when I look back at my migration to see what exactly I did. Okay, so the naming is just for myself. Oh, and before I do this, okay, so what if I did this? I've seen this quite a bit. I have some migrations here, right? I have a create user, I have a create Pokemons. Why can't I just do this? What's wrong with this? I'm gonna migrate. This looks like a migration, right? And I add the column. But what's wrong? What will happen in this case? What do you think?
You're not supposed to change the migration.
I'm not supposed to change the migration file. Okay, but why not? Yeah, what's your name?
You skipped over when you run DB migrate.
And you get skipped over when I run DB migrate? I can check. So change my migration file, migrate a database again. All right, and I look at my schema, and there is no user's ID column to be found, right? Why not? Yeah, what do you think?
I just have a question. Could you just add it to the schema file, or would it still?
So I could try. It's worth a try. All right. So if I go into Rails console and look at my Pokemons, what I expect to see is that Pokemons have a user ID column. And they do not. Okay, so to clarify, to be very clear about what's going on here, schema.rb is not to be touched by you. Okay? In fact, it probably says so right here. This file is auto-generated from the current state of the database. Okay, so what happens when you run RakeDB migrate is that after the migration, Rails goes into the database, looks at the way the database is structured, and then tosses that into schema.rb, just for you to reference. It's not meant for you to change because Rails never actually runs this file unless you tell it to, but we can go over that some other time. Okay, so changing the schema.rb file does not work. And changing this migration doesn't work. The reason why nothing happened when I changed my migration is because of this. Okay, so when I run migrations, when I run RakeDB migrate, Rails says, okay, if I want to migrate, I need to make sure I want to get my schema updated to the latest version. Right, the latest version, this is a timestamp. You can't really tell on there, but that's basically the current time, right? And what happened was I already created this migration, and what Rails does is it looks at that file name right there, which is 2014.01015, blah, blah, blah. And Rails says, okay, because I've done this migration already once, my schema.rb is up to date, and I don't need to run this migration anymore. That's why we say don't change old migration files. It's because of this behavior, right? When we change the old migration file, Rails does not notice that we changed it because it thinks that it doesn't need to run this migration anymore. Okay, any questions about that? Yes.
What's the point of keeping them?
What's the point of keeping the migration files? So the question is, what's the point of having the migration files if after you run them, they're gone forever?
Yes.
And the answer is, what are some possible answers? What can be some uses of migration files? What do you think in the back? Yes, so one reason is you can revert migrations. So if you notice, this column is called change, this thing is called change. And what's actually interesting about this is that if I do something called rake, let me erase this. If I do RakeDB rollback, this rolls back one migration ago. And what it does is it looks at the latest migration and does the opposite of what I did. So if this is create table, Rails will automatically know to use drop table, and it'll drop this table. So just to demonstrate RakeDB rollback, and you see create Pokemons reverted, and I ran drop table on Pokemons. Now if I go into my schema.rb file, my Pokemons table is nowhere to be found. So that's essentially the reason for keeping around migration files. You're right that they're not super necessary, but usually we keep them around anyway. Yeah.
If you update the old migration file, since you rolled it back, will it trick Rails to do it again?
Yep. So the question was, since I rolled back and it thinks that it hasn't updated, it hasn't ran this migration yet, if I changed it now, would the changes actually take place? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. So if I write this, that will work, right? And so I ran a migration and the column would appear in my Pokemon's table. But what's the issue with that approach? What do you think?
We won't do that for the most recent migration.
Okay, I can only do it in the most recent migration. That's true. But technically, I can keep, so if I ran RakeDB rollback multiple times, I can get back to migrations that happened long ago in the past. So technically, I can get back to faraway migrations too. What's the problem? What's the problem here? What do you think in the back?
Doesn't that not exist in the database?
Doesn't that not exist in the database, so it will throw an error? So I'm referring to the case where I roll back the migration, I add this line, and then I RakeDB migrate again. So just to clarify, this actually will do what I want. Okay, so if I migrate now, here's my user ID. Okay, so it did what I want, but there's a problem with this. What's the problem? Yeah. I lose my Pokemon from before. Yes, that's true, but I'll lose them anyway if I did RakeDB. I wouldn't lose them. I would lose like the values of the user ID column. that I had before. But that happens when I do the rollback, not the changing the migration file part. There's something wrong with me changing this migration file. What do you think? Did you have it? Oh, okay. So the problem here is that, so it's a little bit contrived, but you'll see this quite often if you work on an app with other people. But if I roll back and I change this and I migrate again, when someone else gets that change from me and runs rigdb migrate, nothing will change for them, right? Because on their version of the schema, this migration already happened. When I ran rigdb rollback, that happened for my local development database. And for them, when I make this change and I migrate, okay, like it's good for me, right? But for someone else working on it, this change will not take place. Any questions about that? Cool. So all that is to say, don't change old migration files. So I'm going to undo all the bad stuff that I did. So roll back, migrate again. All right, so now we're back to a clean slate. All right, so now let's proceed. Make that migration. Go into my new migration file and add a column. Add a column to the Pokemon's table called user ID and make it an integer. And now when I run rigdb migrate, bam, it's done, and it's done correctly. Okay? Any questions about that so far? Yes.
Does Rails ever auto-generate files?
The question was, does Rails ever auto-generate migration files? And the answer is yes, if you tell it to. So if I wrote, let's say I do the Pokemon 2. If I wrote something here like user ID is an integer, then Rails would know to try to do something. So what it does is if I do add something to something else, it'll take that something else and try to add a column to it, like auto-generate it. But you notice that it was wrong here because I did not, I wrote Pokemon 2 instead of Pokemons. So yes, it works sometimes. Like Rails, if you're familiar with how Rails does it, you can do it pretty quickly. But if not, sometimes it's easier just to make it yourself because you know what's going on. So let's destroy that migration. So handy tip, if you replace the G with a D, that stands for destroy, and it'll undo whatever you generated before. Okay, so Rails G migration does something, D, that same thing, reverts back. Okay, so removes those files. Cool. I can double check that everything is working the way I want it to by going into my console and running Pokemon and seeing that there is, in fact, yes, a user ID. Okay? Now my second step. What's my second step? After I had the column in a database, that was kind of a long way to get to putting a column in the schema. But what do I have to do now? What's next? Yes. Yes, the second step, well, that's a good second step, which is to populate that new column with actual integers. But I'm going to defer that for later and just add in, oops, I do not want to say this. I'm just going to defer that for now and add in the has many and belongs to. So has many Pokemons. Now, one thing about convention here, you'll notice that user is singular, but Pokemon is plural. And the reason for that is kind of grammatical, because you don't say I have many car, and I have many like phone. You say I have many cars and I have many phones. But not only that, it's mostly grammatical, but in a sense you can think of it as when I say user has many Pokemons, this defines, so if I reload, this is also a handy command. If you change your code and you don't want to restart a new console, you can hit reload bang and it'll reload your code. Okay? So I can get my first user. So let's say my first user is you. Okay? And you.Pokemons gets me the list of Pokemons that belongs to that user. So this Pokemons thing makes sense because you get more than one Pokemon back. In fact, if you see this is an empty array here. And so this is plural because we get back multiple things. Pokemon belongs to user. So if I do p equals Pokemon first. All right. Let me reset my database. All right. So if I get back my Pokemon, if I get a Pokemon called P, and I do p.user, p.user will be no. But that .user function was defined because I wrote this line in Pokemon.rb. Okay? Cool. So now that I have the methods in place, let's show the user what happens. Okay? So what I want to do is I want for each user, I not only want to show how many badges he or she has, but I want to have a list of the Pokemon that belong to that user. All right? So let's do that. So if I go into Pokemon's index.users, sorry, like that, I can open up this file. Another handy tip if you're using Sublime is that I can do, you've probably seen me do this like the entire lecture, but if I do Command P, I can look up the file lookup thingy, and then I can just look up users index, and this will give me the same file. So it's a quicker way to get to my stuff. And so here you see what I'm doing. I'm taking all my users. So to be clear, users controller, from the index action, I'm grabbing all the users. And so in my index view, I'm looping through all my users and showing their name and number of badges they have. So pretty straightforward. If I want to show the Pokemon, well, remember how I used it before? I had u equals user.first, and I got the Pokemon by doing u.Pokemons, and that gave me an array. So with that array, so if I do user.Pokemons, with that array I can loop and then display the Pokemon. So let's say Pokemon.name. What else do I got? And Pokemon.level. Or yeah. All right, and let's end that. Okay. And if I go here and refresh, nothing changed. Why not?
You haven't put it, like you haven't populated the database with real values, so everyone has no Pokemon.
Exactly. So I did not, as Helen alluded to before, I did not actually set the user ID of any Pokemon, so no Pokemon belongs to anybody. So let's do that right now. So in my C's.rb file, I not only want to give it a name and level and description, but I also want to set its user ID to like 1, just for instance. Now I'm going to move it below here to avoid an error. Why would I get an error? Well, I might not get an error, but the fact is that if I create the users, if I create the Pokemon before I create the users, there will be no user IDs in my database in the first place. So this one doesn't really make any sense. If I wanted to be very explicit about what I'm doing, I could do something like user.first.id, and that would make sure that I would get some valid ID for a Pokemon, right? So if I want to run this seeds file again, So what's the problem if I run this right now? What's the problem? I'll get some unexpected behavior. What would be the behavior? Any takers? Something will go wrong. All right, well, let's find out. So nothing errored. Well, let's go and see in our browser what happened. So what happened? Look at this page. What happened? What do you think? It made everything again. Why? I have 2 Ashes, I have 2 Garys, I have 2 Missys. Why do I have 2 of each thing? Yeah. Yeah, that's getting closer. So when I ran this seeds file, right? When I ran the seeds file, I just said, oh, create users with these names. I never told it to get rid of the old users. When I ran rakedbc, I just said create them with these names. And if there's stuff there before, like, don't worry about it, just create anyway, right? And so that's why I had this curious behavior where I have Ash with no Pokemon and Ash with all the Pokemon. Because I had these guys before, I didn't get rid of them, and then I added more Pokemon. I added more Pokemon and I added more users. So if I went to the Pokemons, I would see double of everything again. So before I rake DB so technically what I want to do, the command that I use is rakedb setup. So rakedb setup will drop the database first and get rid of it and then seed it. So if I do this, it should behave better and get rid of my duplicate Pokemon. So there we go, back to normal. Users, back to normal. Ash has all the Pokemon. This is messy, so I'm going to make it slightly nicer to look at. All right, oops. All right, so there are Ash's Pokemon. All right, pretty simple. So let's go to the Pokemons, and let's do the same thing. So Bulbasaur should, like, all the Pokemon should say who they belong to. So I'm going to go to my Pokemons index.html and say, okay, you belong to trainer, and I'm going to say Pokemon.user. Okay. Now what should happen is when I refresh, I get this. Why do I get this curious output? What do you think?
You can put like user name or whatever. This for user will just relatively give you user object, but I know it's not an object. It's going to give you user object and probably some sort of address, basically an address.
Yeah, that's right. So the answer was, I said my trainer. Gosh, that is like illegible. My trainer is Pokemon.user. Pokemon.user is just an object of some sort. And so when it displays out, it just displays as like the user with the memory address that this user lives in. So what I really want is the user's name, because that's legible. And so if I do that and I refresh, I get back a nice thing that says all the Pokemon belong to Ash. Cool. Any questions? All right. That's it. So what did we start out with? We started out with Pokemon and users that did not have any relationship. We walked through in a very long-winded and meandering way, but I hope educational way, about how to create the migration, how to add the lines of code, how to add the thing in the Cs, and then display that data to the user. And that's the fact, Jack. Cool. So step 0, initialize. I was supposed to like do this cool thing where I would like go through the steps and then like do the code, but Okay, so that's what happened. All right, and so we have a lab prepared for you guys today. So you can take out your computers now and please work on this with a partner. And the check-in code for today, the check-in code for today is given to you after you finish the lab. There's a form that you fill out. So do it. It's good for you. It's good for you.
We have one